Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
There's something about birthdays that reveals people's true faces. You think you're celebrating another year of life, but what you're actually doing is showing up for a carefully staged performance, where everyone plays their part, where the lines are already written, and the applause is always reserved for someone else. Mine was no different. In fact, it was worse than most. That night, as I sat at my parents' dining table for what was supposed to be my 35th birthday dinner, surrounded by smiling faces that had never once truly seen me, I realized this was no celebration. It was an execution. The table was set with Judith's usual flair for pretending everything was perfect. Crystal glasses that only came out for Easter, and death anniversaries, silverware that hadn't touched a dishwasher in 20 years, and Mom's idea of a fancy meal, overcooked roast beef swimming in too much gravy and dry potatoes that might have been made 3 days ago. Michael, my father, sat at the head of the table, hunched slightly forward, as if the weight of everything unsaid over the last 3 decades was finally crushing his spine. He barely looked at me when I walked in, just grunted a low, "Hey, kiddo," without lifting his eyes from his plate. To his left sat Chloe, my younger sister by 4 years, in a white silk blouse and her usual air of effortless victimhood. The kind of girl who could cry on command and still look like the wrong party after stealing your car and sleeping with your boyfriend. I used to think she was simply misunderstood. Turns out, she understood the game better than anyone. She didn't have to fight for attention. It was always waiting for her, like a trained dog. Dinner dragged on, the usual small talk, the usual tension under every sentence. I didn't say much, just nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected. My appetite had died years ago, buried somewhere between my 13th birthday, when they forgot to buy me a cake, and the Christmas I got a used sweater while Chloe opened a brand new iPad. You learn to lower expectations until they scrape the floor, then you dig a little deeper and live there. Then Judith stood up. I could tell something was coming by the way she smoothed down her dress and smiled at everyone like a queen about to make an announcement from her throne. "Well," she said, drawing out the word like it was the opening act of a Broadway show, "we thought it would be nice to end dinner with something sweet, something special." I sat up a little, not out of hope, but to brace myself. And then she came back from the kitchen with a cake, but it wasn't for me. She placed it right in front of Chloe. Chocolate ganache, my favorite. Except there was no "Happy Birthday, Rachel" written on it. No candles. Just a simple message in frosted white letters. "You deserve it." Chloe squealed, "Oh my God, Mom, you didn't." Judith laughed that high, fake laugh of hers that always sounded like someone choking on glass. "Well, sweetheart, we thought you deserved something nice too. You've had such a hard few months. It's been a rough year, and you've been so strong through it all." No one looked at me, not even Michael. Not when Chloe thanked everyone, not when she cut the first slice and passed it to herself, and not when she turned to me, eyes wide and innocent, and said, "You don't mind, right, Rach? I mean, it's your birthday and all, but I've been dealing with a lot lately." I smiled, a tight, practiced one, the kind I'd worn so long it fit like a second skin. And then I stood up. "I brought something too," I said, reaching into my bag. "Nothing fancy, just something I thought you all might want to see." I handed the folder to Michael, who looked confused for a second, then took it with fingers still greasy from the roast. He opened it slowly, like he already knew he wouldn't like what he was about to find. I watched his expression shift. First confusion, then recognition, and finally something close to fear. His chewing stopped mid-bite. He didn't swallow, didn't speak. Everyone noticed. The room went still, like we'd all been thrown into a freezer. Judith frowned. "Michael, what is it?" He didn't answer, just kept staring at the paper in his hands. Then flipped to the next one, and the next. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, and I saw the exact moment her face lost all its color. She grabbed the folder from him, her hands shaking as she skimmed through it. "What the hell is this?" And I just stood there, still smiling, still calm, still that same invisible daughter no one ever bothered to really know. Only now, I wasn't the one in the spotlight. They were. I leaned forward slightly, voice low but clear. "Happy birthday to me." And just like that, the silence exploded into chaos. Chloe's voice rising, Judith yelling at Michael, papers flying. No one knew what to say to me, but that was the point. Because the game was finally mine to play, and I wasn't holding back anymore. Have you ever been so overlooked by your own family that it felt like being erased in real time? Ever watched your sister open a cake on your birthday while everyone applauded her pain and ignored yours? Let me know in the comments, because maybe I'm not the only one who realized too late that love in some homes comes with conditions. And receipts. 6 months before the birthday that split my family like a cracked windshield. Hit dead center by a rock. I was sitting alone in my small second-floor apartment, surrounded by a silence that had long since become familiar, not because it was peaceful, but because it was preferable to the kind of noise that defined every interaction with my family. It was late, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was on my third glass of cheap red wine, the kind that stains your teeth if you don't drink it fast enough. And I remember staring at my laptop screen, blinking hard, trying to decide whether I was drunk enough to delete the email or sober enough to open the attachment. That attachment was the beginning of everything, and I think, deep down, I already knew that once I clicked it, there was no going back. No returning to the obedient, quiet daughter role I had been guilt-tripped into playing since childhood. The email had come from an old friend of my late grandmother, someone I barely remembered but who had apparently never forgotten me. The subject line read, "You should know this, Rachel." Inside the folder, the one I handed my father, were documents that detailed more than just betrayal. They mapped out years of manipulation dressed up as protection, lies repackaged as parental wisdom, and a quiet theft that had occurred right under my nose, orchestrated by people who had always claimed to love me. The attachment was a scanned copy of a will, my grandmother's will, but it wasn't the version I had been told about. The official story, the one Judith had spoon-fed me like it was gospel, was that Grandma June had left the bulk of her estate to help the family, which, in her words, meant Chloe, because she was younger, still building her life, and had more need. I'd swallowed that pill without protest, even when it choked me, because I didn't want to seem petty, didn't want to stir the pot, and honestly, didn't want to face the ugly possibility that it had all been a lie. But the document I received told a different story altogether. It was a version of the will that had been signed just 2 weeks before Grandma June passed away, dated, notarized, and witnessed. And it left everything to me, not just the lake house where we spent summers, but her entire savings account, her stocks, her pension, and even a small business she owned out of state that I had never known existed. Everything, to me. To my granddaughter Rachel, who was always there when it mattered, who never asked for much, and who never needed to be reminded to love. Those words were in her handwriting, on a separate note attached to the back of the will. I sat there reading them over and over, blinking until the letters blurred together, wondering why no one had ever shown this to me. The answer came quickly and brutally. I dug deeper, contacted the lawyer whose name was listed on the documents. Turns out he had been fired shortly after June's death, replaced by a new firm, one Judith had picked. I asked if he had any idea why I never received this version of the will. He hesitated, then said something that sent ice down my spine. "I was told you weren't interested, that you said you didn't want anything, and that we should just proceed with the updated documents." When I told him I had never even spoken to him, there was a long pause, followed by a low, "Then someone lied, Rachel," and they had the authority to do it. From that moment on, something inside me changed. It wasn't rage, not yet, but something colder, something more calculating. I started looking into every corner of my family's finances, using the fact that I worked in accounting to slip through the cracks most people ignored. I pulled credit reports, tracked bank transactions, and combed through property records like a detective with a personal vendetta. And that's when I found the second bombshell. There was a bank account in my name, opened by my parents, supposedly to save for my future, but never disclosed to me. It had once held over $50,000, birthday money, gifts from extended family, even a portion of Grandma June's life insurance. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the transaction history, watching the balance shrink year by year until it hit zero. Every withdrawal marked as family expense or education support, but the timestamps didn't lie. Most of the big withdrawals had Chloe's name written all over them: college tuition payments, emergency travel, even a security deposit for her condo in San Diego. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stared at the screen until the sun came up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a daughter anymore. I felt like a stranger with blood ties to thieves. So I started collecting. I printed everything, created spreadsheets, copied documents, even recorded a few conversations. I visited my grandmother's old lawyer in person, asked him to write a statement confirming everything. I organized it all into a thick, tan folder, the kind my father used to carry to work every morning when he still believed in things like ambition and integrity. And then I waited. I waited through Mother's Day, when Chloe got a diamond bracelet, and I got a call that went straight to voicemail. I waited through family BBQs, where I played the role of background furniture, while Chloe was toasted for her resilience. And I waited through each smile, each backhanded compliment, each condescending nod Judith threw my way. Like a bone to a dog she didn't particularly like. I smiled back. I clapped. I stayed quiet. Until my 35th birthday, when I handed the folder to the man who had once sworn he'd always be honest with me, and watched his world begin to unravel one page at a time. And that was just the beginning. It's a strange thing, really, the way a person begins to understand the quiet rules of their family, not the spoken ones about chores or curfews, but the ones you only figure out by stepping on emotional landmines and learning not to flinch when the shrapnel of disappointment cuts deep. From the moment Chloe was born, the balance shifted, and while nobody ever said it out loud, it became painfully obvious that she was the center of gravity in our little household universe. I was 8 when she arrived, old enough to understand that something had changed, but too young to explain why it hurt so much to see my mother's smile reserved for someone else, or to notice that my father's attention seemed to be permanently fixed on the pink bundle that cried and screamed but was still somehow treated like a miracle. Looking back, it wasn't one single moment that defined my role in the family. It was 1,000 small ones, a slow drip of inequality that eventually soaked into my skin until I stopped noticing how heavy it felt. Like when Chloe got caught lying about breaking Mom's favorite vase, and I, believing honesty still counted for something, told the truth, only to be scolded for snitching and sent to my room. Or the time I made the honor roll 3 semesters in a row, and the most I got was a distracted, "That's nice, honey," while Chloe was given a new phone for not failing algebra. I used to wonder if I was being too sensitive, if maybe the love was there, just quieter for me, more subtle. But no amount of self-delusion could cover the bruises left by being invisible. Judith, never Mom in my internal monologue, just Judith, because she always seemed more like a warden than a mother, had a way of lifting Chloe up while pushing me down without ever saying anything overtly cruel. It was all in the tone, the comparisons, the sighs of exasperation when I wanted to do something different or independent. When I chose to go to a state college instead of staying close like Chloe did, Judith told me I was selfish. When I got a job promotion in another city, she didn't even call to say congratulations. She texted Chloe to ask if I was okay emotionally. Meanwhile, Chloe could bounce from boyfriend to boyfriend, job to job, mess to mess, and still be greeted with soft tones and "she's just finding herself" excuses. The rules were different for her. The expectations were lighter. The forgiveness was infinite. The older we got, the clearer it became that Chloe had been handed a script. Play the part of the fragile, beautiful daughter who needed protection, and you would be rewarded. I, on the other hand, was given no lines at all, just told to stand in the background and applaud her performance. I used to believe that if I was just good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, they would notice me too. But it doesn't matter how well you play your role. When the director never intended for you to be seen, And yet, despite the years of imbalance, I kept trying. Birthdays, holidays, Mother's Day brunches, I showed up, brought gifts, asked questions, listened. I watched my father laugh at Chloe's bad jokes while barely making eye contact with me. I watched Judith pour wine for Chloe before dinner while forgetting to even ask if I wanted something. It was so subtle, so polished, that outsiders might never notice. But I noticed. I always noticed. It wasn't until I was 33, 2 years before the cake incident, that I started questioning whether this pattern was just favoritism or something far darker. That was when Chloe called me in the middle of the night, drunk and sobbing about how her boyfriend had left her after finding out about the thing with the money. She never explained what thing, and I was too exhausted to ask. But she kept talking, slurring her words, and somewhere in that hour-long call, she mentioned the name of our family lawyer, the one Judith started using after Grandma June died. She said something about signing something to help Mom get it all through, and then she laughed, this bitter, almost proud laugh that made my skin crawl. "You know Mom always finds a way," she said. "She's smarter than people think. Sneaky smart." I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of a woman who had never faced consequences for anything laugh at the way our mother manipulated the world. And I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride, kept my mouth shut, let things slide in the name of keeping peace. But that night, the peace didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like a prison I'd built brick by brick just to survive. So I did what Judith never expected. I started digging, not just into finances or wills, but into the emotional archive of our family. The photo albums where I was always on the edge of the frame, the home videos where my voice was talked over or ignored, the school projects that were never hung on the fridge. I watched it all again, and this time, I didn't excuse it. I didn't rationalize. I accepted it for what it was, proof. But the real turning point came a few weeks later, when Chloe showed up at my apartment unannounced. She was crying again, something about needing help, about running out of options, and I let her in. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed more time, more leverage. We sat on my couch while she rambled, and I asked questions, simple ones, open-ended, and she answered. She talked too much, like she always did when she felt safe, and that's when she told me about the will. "It's not like you were ever going to do anything with that house anyway," she said. "You were never there like I was. You were always so distant." She didn't know I had my phone recording the entire conversation in my pocket. She didn't know that every word was becoming part of the file I would eventually hand to our father. She told me Judith had promised to handle everything, that they'd all agreed it was better if things stayed within the right hands. She admitted she forged my signature twice. She said she'd done it out of love, because you wouldn't understand how much pressure Mom was under. And through all of this, I just nodded, smiled, poured her another glass of wine. Because sometimes the best revenge doesn't come with a scream or a slap. Sometimes it starts with a quiet recording and ends with your sister realizing the entire performance she's been starring in was never hers to control. Not anymore. There is a particular kind of silence that follows betrayal. Not the kind that falls over a room after someone says something uncomfortable, but the deeper, more suffocating kind that seeps into your bloodstream, that settles into your bones, that makes the air feel heavier around you even when no one is speaking. That silence filled my apartment in the days following Chloe's unexpected confession, and even though she had left believing we'd shared some kind of intimate sisterly reconciliation, what she had actually left behind was a ticking time bomb, one she didn't even know she'd armed, and one I had every intention of detonating at just the right moment. I must have replayed that recording 20 times the night after she left. Not because I needed to hear it again to believe it, but because every single word felt like a puzzle piece falling perfectly into place, completing an image I had only glimpsed in fragments for the past 10 years. Her voice, syrupy and dramatic, swung between self-pity and smugness in a way that might have made me sick if I hadn't been so used to hearing that tone come from both her and Judith. I could hear the whine in her throat, could hear the performative whimper when she said, "It was just easier this way. You never liked that house anyway." And then the part that sealed everything. Mom said no one would ever believe you if you found out. She said you were too emotional to be trusted. That line didn't hurt me, it vindicated me, because it proved something I'd suspected for years, that my mother's coldness wasn't just passive indifference, it was strategic. She had painted me as unstable, unreliable, too sensitive to be taken seriously, and she had done it with a consistency so subtle and steady that even I had started to believe it. What neither of them counted on was that I had learned something they hadn't. I had learned patience. While Judith and Chloe operated on emotion, on fear and control, I had learned to hold my breath, to wait, to let them speak and unravel themselves while I stayed quiet and watched. I'd been doing it for years, I just hadn't realized how useful it would become. After the recording, everything started moving faster. I made multiple copies and uploaded them to 3 different encrypted cloud accounts. I wrote a transcript by hand, word for word, and printed it out on paper that smelled like ink and revenge. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Because the truth wasn't just in the words Chloe had said that night. It was in everything they'd done before that. Everything they assumed would remain hidden. I went back to the documents in the folder. The ones that outlined the forged will, the drained bank account, the financial trail of lies. And I realized I needed something more. Something visual. Something undeniable. So I drove 3 hours to the storage unit my grandmother had kept for over a decade. The one I had inherited the key to, but had never opened. Mostly because I'd assumed it was just filled with old furniture and photo albums. What I found inside was more than I expected. There were boxes of letters, notes, receipts, even a handwritten journal June had kept for the last 5 years of her life. And in that journal, between pages written in a shaky but determined hand, she detailed everything she had begun to suspect. After Chloe started visiting her alone toward the end, how Judith had started intercepting her mail, how documents she had asked to be sent to her lawyer mysteriously went missing, how she had begun to feel like she was being managed by her own daughter. But the part that gutted me, really gutted me, was a short entry written 2 weeks before her death. I asked Rachel to visit, but Judith told me she was too busy. I don't believe her. Rachel always came. Always. I just wish I had more time to set things right. I hope she knows I tried. I sat on the floor of that cold, dusty unit, knees pulled to my chest like I was 8 years old again, and I cried, not out of sadness, not even out of anger, but because for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not just by a dead woman who had been robbed of her voice, but by my own memory, which I had spent too long second-guessing. I packed that journal into the folder, tucked it between the transcript and the notarized documents, and I added a small USB drive on it, the recording of course, but also scans of everything from the storage unit. I wanted no room for argument, no space for gaslighting. I wasn't leaving any cracks they could slip through. They had used my silence as their shield for decades, and now I was going to use their own words as the sword that finally cut through it all. I rehearsed what I would say for days, leading up to the birthday dinner. I played it all in my head like a movie, how I would hand my father the folder, how he would react, how Judith would try to take control of the moment, how Chloe would start crying and deny everything, only to be hit with the cold, inarguable truth of her own voice played back at her from a small speaker. But what I didn't expect was the way my hands would tremble, just slightly, when I actually passed him that folder. Or the way my father's expression would shift from confusion to recognition, to something approaching terror as he flipped through the pages, each one undoing the narrative he had either blindly accepted or knowingly helped uphold. I hadn't planned for the silence that fell after he reached the end, a silence so thick it swallowed the sound of Judith's fork clinking against her plate and Chloe's nervous laughter dying in her throat. That silence wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a family collapsing under the weight of its own lies. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about justice anymore. This was about making them look at me, really look at me, for the first time in their lives, and realize that the daughter they dismissed, the sister they used, and the woman they underestimated had just rewritten the ending to a story they thought they controlled. But it still wasn't the end, because the final blow, the one they never saw coming, hadn't even been revealed yet. There is a moment right before the truth lands when time seems to slow, not in a cinematic, graceful kind of way, but in the suffocating stillness of anticipation, when you realize the dam is about to break and there's no turning back. That was the atmosphere in the dining room after my father opened the folder, after the weight of evidence began pressing against the fragile walls of the fantasy they had built around Chloe and Judith, and the myth of our family being anything more than a curated illusion for birthdays and holidays. I watched as the color drained from their faces, not because of one document or one sentence, but because each page was another link in a chain they didn't know I had been forging for months. And as I stood there, breathing in the silence that had once felt like punishment, but now felt like power, I reached into my bag one final time and pulled out the small black flash drive that would drive the nail straight into the heart of every lie they had ever spoken. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the drive next to my father's elbow, made eye contact, and nodded once. He hesitated, not because he didn't understand what it was, but because on some level, I think he already knew that what was on it would destroy any hope of pretending things could ever go back to the way they were. After a pause that felt like it stretched across years of suppressed conversations and swallowed insults, he stood up, walked to the television in the corner, and plugged the drive into the port. The screen blinked to life, and for a moment, all anyone could hear was the low hum of the TV warming up. Then, Chloe's voice filled the room. It wasn't the dramatic, mascara-streaked Chloe who knew how to cry without ruining her lipstick. It was the unfiltered, slightly slurred Chloe from the night at my apartment, confessing her crimes with the kind of careless arrogance that only exists in people who have never had to face consequences. She talked about the forged signature, about how Judith had told her to just get it done because I was too passive to fight back. She laughed about the account they emptied in my name, joked about how I'd probably just get over it eventually, and even threw in a comment about how Dad never asks questions anyway. Judith tried to speak then, to protest, to interject with some half-baked excuse, but the audio drowned her out, just as she had drowned me out for decades. On the screen was a simple title card after the audio ended, white letters on a black background. You said no one would believe me. I made sure they didn't have a choice. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was heavier, denser, as if even the air had turned its back on them. My father sat down slowly, the remote still in his hand, his eyes not on me, but on the floor, where pieces of his carefully maintained denial now lay scattered like broken glass. Judith, ever the strategist, tried to regain control, started spinning a narrative about how they did it for the good of the family, how I wouldn't have known what to do with all that responsibility, and how Chloe was barely holding herself together back then. But the words fell flat, dead things that couldn't resurrect the lie. Chloe didn't say much at all. She just sat there, stiff and wide-eyed, the same look she'd had when she got caught shoplifting in high school. Except this time, there was no mother to shield her and no father to quietly pay the bill and sweep it under the rug. And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry or make a speech. I just stood there, hands resting lightly on the back of the chair I'd been sitting in, and I let the silence speak for me. Because in that moment, I realized the most powerful revenge is not explosive or dramatic. It's surgical, it's clean. It's watching the people who always thought you were too quiet, too nice, too weak, suddenly realize you were simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As I turned to leave, I paused in the doorway, not for dramatic effect, but because there was still one thing left. One final turn of the knife that would ensure they didn't just feel guilt, but genuine loss. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to my father without looking at him. "It's from the lawyer," I said, my voice calm but undeniable. "Effective last month, the title of the lake house is no longer in your name, or Judith's. Grandma June left it to me, and now it's officially mine. I've signed the documents. I'll be moving in next week." There was a beat, just long enough for the words to land, before I added, without a trace of malice but with full intention, "You'll need to find somewhere else to host Thanksgiving." And with that, I walked out, not with triumph, not with vengeance boiling in my chest, but with a strange sense of stillness, like the first breath after a long swim, like coming up for air after years spent underwater. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did, but for myself. The thing is, people like Judith and Chloe never really believe that the quiet ones will fight back. They build their castles on the assumption that some of us are too afraid to swing, but what they never understood, and what they finally learned that night, is that silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. And yet, even as I sat in my car outside, watching the warm glow of the dining room through the window, a part of me wondered, not whether they'd recover, not whether they'd hate me, but whether they'd even understand what they had lost. Not the money, not the house, but me. Because for the first time, I wasn't just the daughter in the background. I was the reckoning. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only birthday gift I ever truly wanted.